Hi, everybody. I don't know if you can see me. Is my audio okay?
You can put some thumbs up if you can hear Hans, and then we'll.
I can see another Dutch woman, Anneke Jongbloed, and Mel van der Mark. I don't know if you're Dutch or if you just have a Dutch name, but Holland did pretty well in the opening game of the World Cup, so we're all happy. Senegal was never an easy opponent.
Hey, I think we've got the first group, so we are just going to kick off. So please do put in any questions you have throughout this session into the chat, and we will have time at the end to ask any questions you might have about architecture or any questions you have for Hans throughout this presentation. So we are joined, as you can see, by Hans, who is an adjunct professor at NUS and has been for around 20 years or so, but also owns his own firm doing architecture. So not only is he a professor, but he is also very much working in the industry. So please do ask any questions you have about careers and about architecture in general. So I am not going to lose any more time, and we are going to pass straight over to Hans to start the lecture on architecture. So thank you very much for coming, everybody, and I will see you at the end.
All right. Okay. Well, I think what I want to do is maybe preface the discussion, and I need to share my screen. So I'm going to try that first. And then if I can, you can probably see everything now, I'm guessing. So what you should be seeing is a title sheet that is Architecture, the Art of Making. When I was asked to do this talk, I thought about what the intent of the talk is, which is very important. And it wasn't about telling you about the study of architecture at university, NUS or any other university. It's really about explaining what fascinates me about architecture and what got me involved and what has kept me involved for the last 35 years. And it's the idea that architecture is the art of making things. We make buildings. Right from the earliest ages, you know, mankind has tried to protect himself from the environment, hot, cold, dry, wet, whatever it may be, and taken materials to harness those to create shelters. So it's really about the making of shelters. And so I'm going to take you through a bit of a history of the notion of making of things. And the idea is to get you interested in the fundamentals of what architecture is about. Because if you're fascinated with the idea of making space, making form, making material, and understanding those relationships between technology and space, then I think architecture may be for you. So I'll talk a little bit about materials and how they sort of have informed how we've explored architecture. Stone, as you very well know, has always been around as a material to be used. You can remember probably from your history lessons, the pyramids of Giza, which are about 4,500 years old. But this is really more of a monumental architecture to house a pharaoh's tomb. When you talk about buildings that house people, you've got to go probably a bit later in that era and look at the Egyptian temples. This is the temples of Luxor, where eventually stone is harnessed to make space. And in here, you can see that these columns are spaced in a particular sort of dimension in order to be able to span a piece of stone that goes from side to side. So it's all about how big a piece of stone could be cut and transported and lifted in place. And so you end up with an architecture where the column spacing looks incredibly tight, but it's basically predicated on the technology at the time, which is the ability to span from column to column with a great piece of stone. And so you end up with these amazing spaces. And that's what I enjoy about it, is that you understand the reason why these columns are this size and the reason why they're this close together. And so it forms a space, but it's actually underlying, its underlying intelligence is based on understanding how it was made. Later on, you get the Romans, probably about 2,000 years later, it's about 500 BC. They came up with a really clever idea. What if we cut stone and arrange it in this kind of compression arch, which is basically a part of a circle? And they found that they could actually span long distances with very little material. So you can see how thin this is. And so it became another advancement of the use of stone. So columns don't have to be so close together again, because they've managed to span it with a very clever invention, which is a piece of geometry. That then led to arches, and you can see them all over the world, the Roman arches in the Arc de Triomphe on the Champs-Élysées. You'll see them in other places. If you're familiar with the aqueduct, which was a great Roman invention of bringing water to their cities from a long way away, and because it was gravity flow, they had to basically make a pathway from the source in the mountains to the city that had to overcome valleys and dales and hills. And these aqueducts were a way of doing that. So the water would run along the top of this and go on its way to Rome. or the nearest city. And so these arches were a way to span this valley in a very effective way. And I love the way that this piece of architecture interfaces with the valley, and it becomes this dialogue between the need to bring water to a place and the reality of the land and the terrain. Later on, they realized that if you actually do a pointed arch, which is a Gothic arch, this is somewhere around 800 AD, so we're now going about 1200 years ago, you could actually come up with much more adventurous structures, very lightweight structures that go up towards the sky. And if you ever have a chance to go visit a Gothic cathedral, whether it's Notre Dame or Chartres in France or Bath even in the UK, you'll see these amazing structures that date back probably about 1200 years, where architects and builders, effectively engineers, they weren't engineers per se, they were just master builders, understood the way to create these very light structures that could rise up to the heavens, reflect their interest in aspiring to God, and understand the structural forces that come from them. So these arches all push out against each other, and they need to be dealt with on the outside with what they call flying buttresses. So you get this sort of architecture, which is, again, a beautiful reflection of need. None of this is decorative. And that's the beauty of what I call essential architecture. It is informed by the material being used, the way it's assembled, and the spaces you create. And so as such, you end up with these amazing structures that if you ever go to a cathedral and you look at it with the eyes of an architect, you go, I understand why things are the way they are. And that's the underlying interest in architecture. This is in Florence, which is another great city, and was the birthplace of the Renaissance, sort of around the mid-1400s. Brunelleschi, the Italian architect who designed this dome, which was at that time the largest dome in Christendom, it's almost 50 meters in diameter, held up by bricks. So it's a very challenging structure to make a 50-meter diameter dome, half a football field, held up by little bricks that are no bigger than, 20 cm by 10. So he came up with a very clever construction, which is a vault, obviously a rotated vault. It's a double shell. So there's an inner shell and outer shell connected by timber beams. And he came up with a way to stop the whole thing from collapsing, because if you just stack bricks up, they may actually twist and break off. So he created this sort of herringbone feature, which became part of the way he built it. And when you go to Florence, and if you ever get the chance, make sure you pay the ticket to go up in the dome. And you walk between the two shells and you see the brickwork there that's now 600, 700 years old, and it's still holding up. So again, these architects were experimenters who were trying to create something and then thought about the best way to achieve that. Wood is another great material. In the early days, it was just a piece of tree that was cut down. And so the bigger the tree, the longer the piece of wood. But very quickly, people realized I can make things out of smaller pieces of wood. But because of the cleverness of where you assemble it, you can actually make much longer beams that are what we would call composite beams, no longer depending on the size of the tree, but based on the intelligence of the mind that creates the geometries that allows you to do these long span structures. And again, at the highest level, architecture means that you can take the wood structures and create something that is quite magical. This is a little chapel in the US made out of a very sort of lightweight timber structure, and just beautifully conceived of as a structural system manifest as a spiritual place. And that's what I like about the notion of architecture, the ability to take material and to create emotion, to take somebody and lead them into a space and they go, wow, this is amazing what we've been able to create out of material. Eventually, we came up with the idea of, if we can't make big pieces of wood out of a tree, what if we glued pieces of wood together? And so these are little pieces of wood that have been glued together. It's called laminated glue lam beams, which allows you to create a giant beam that's been created by basically gluing together smaller pieces. And so all of a sudden, a new technology allows for new expressions of architecture. This is an airline hangar, which can take a Boeing 747, made out of glue lam beams, but done in a clever way where the structure itself becomes a shell, and therefore can be supported on very few columns, because the shell itself is a bit like a beam itself. If you take a piece of paper and you roll it into a tube, it's actually quite stiff. It's like a cardboard tube versus a flat piece of paper. Or this stadium, which is a hockey stadium made out of timber glue lam beams, which is taking a page out of the Gothic cathedrals, but now building it out of wood. And I love the ability for architecture to reinterpret traditions in new materials. And that's something that's happening more and more these days, because we have new technologies and new materials that are lending themselves to reinterpreting space. Steel, of course, is a relatively modern material. It came about sort of in the 1800s when industrialized processes were brought into play. If you think about the train stations of Europe, the grand, Victorian train stations of England, these are beautiful steel structures. This one here was probably from the mid-1800s. It was called the Crystal Palace in London. It was built out of small pieces and assembled. And that's one of the beautiful things about steel is that it's actually a kind of like a kit of parts. You take, smaller elements and you bolt or weld them together, and then you create larger pieces of architecture. You're probably all very familiar with this one. It was built in sort of the late 1800s, about 1880. Gustave Eiffel, who was a French engineer who was building a commemorative structure for the World Fair that was held in Paris at the time. And he designed this tower made out of steel that is about 300 meters tall, and it's still there today. So obviously well built. It's about 125, 130 years old. And it's an amazing structure because it's so light. I mean, obviously it's a big form. It spans an entire street at the base, and obviously goes up 300 meters, which is taller than pretty much any building you've probably been around. But in fact, it's made up out of smaller pieces. And that's the whole idea about the intelligence of assembly, where you see these small pieces are not very big. They're actually all transportable by man. And so two people could carry any beam, or even the majority of the beams you can see are actually quite small, like this. They had some larger ones on the corners, but this is a guy during the construction of the Eiffel Tower. And it's quite amazing at how efficient this structure is in terms of weight. When you compare that to the first slide I showed, which was the stone structures of Egypt, where a column that might be 9 meters tall and 2 meters diameter could easily be, I don't know, 20, 30 tons. This structure here weighs 7,300 tons, the entire structure, which sounds like a lot. It's 7.3 million kilograms. So imagine that somebody's 73 kg. This is going to be 100,000 people's worth, but it is a 300-meter structure. To give it some perspective, if you were to melt all of the iron down into a ball, just one ball, it would only be 6 meters diameter, which is not that big. If you were to take this into a magic machine that could reduce it in size magically by just scaling everything down, like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, from 300 meters to 30 centimeters, it would weigh only 7.3 grams. Now, an A4 sheet of paper is about 5 grams. So it's a little bit heavier than one sheet of A4 paper. That's how light this would be. You would hardly feel it when you picked it up. And that's because most of it's air. And the pieces, if they're this size, in reality, they're going to be the size of not even a hair, a nano sort of dimension. So again, the interest of how architecture and geometry has managed to transform material into form. This guy is Buckminster Fuller. He's a great architect of this last century, the 20th century, and he invented something called the geodesic dome, which you can see here is again another kind of geometry which says if I take the dome and I divide it up into triangles, then I can make it extremely light. You can see a helicopter here picking up a fairly large dome. And that has become the basis for quite a lot of structures. You'll see geodesic domes around. But again, Buckminster Fuller was an inventor. He thought about the problem of material. He thought about the problem of geometry. He said, okay, let's try and find something out that harnesses material in the most efficient way. Here you'll see a project in the UK. If you ever get out to Cornwall, it's called the Eden Project, which is a large kind of landscaping project where Cornwall wanted to have habitats underneath, like a greenhouse, and generate different climate zones. And you can see here, these domes are geodesic domes that span huge distances, and they cover entire hillsides. And you can get a sense of the scale of this when you look at one of these hexagons, which is a 6-sided geometry, and you realize how big it is. There's a guy maintaining the roof of this thing, right? That's one element. And these hexagons are basically filled with something called ETFE, which is a kind of cushion of plastic inflated with a kind of inert gas, which is almost weightless, like helium. And so the entire structure is incredibly light. And so again, we find ourselves in an era today where materials and ecological footprint is becoming more and more relevant, where we're trying to do more with less, trying to do more efficient things, trying to have a lower carbon footprint. Architecture deals with all of that as well. And then at the very end of the spectrum, you've got things that are very low tech, but quite interesting. Bamboo as a material, super fast growing, extremely sustainable, very low carbon footprint. And so people are now exploring how bamboo can lend itself to creating structures whether it's sort of a reinterpretation of a more traditional kind of timber building, or even trying to do these larger sort of arch structures, a bit like the bridge structures, but made out of strapped pieces of bamboo. You can see these are all like 5 pieces of bamboo that have been strapped together and therefore create a beam, as it were. And then using bamboo almost exclusively, except for the nipa roofing, to create this large shelter that's very low carbon footprint, low weight, and extremely low cost. Here's another bamboo structure, which is a large sort of religious space. It's basically a circular plan and a kind of dome. This is under construction. This is a complete. When you look up on it, it's just a beautiful piece of architectural reinterpretation of the traditional dome. So you will have seen domes in, the history of the built environment, all the way from, the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul to the dome we saw earlier in Florence. And this is just another iteration of, okay, someone thinking, can I build a dome out of bamboo? And the answer is yes. And so those are the problems that architects at the highest level deal with. And finally, I'm going to show one more project, which shows that even to the degree to which your creativity can apply itself. Shigeru Ban is a very creative architect out of Japan, and he got involved with disaster shelters to help people who were stuck in earthquakes or floods or avalanches. And so he learned the ability to harness cardboard tube manufacturing and to create shelters out of cardboard tubing. And so there was a church that he wanted to build for a community that was displaced. And so he designed this church made out of cardboard tubing. So here's a structural model. It's basically a little concept model of the building. And it was based on the idea that you can take traditional cardboard tubing, like you would find in the center of a toilet roll or a kitchen roll. It's a very simple machine that's actually on site, can make it out of the raw material and spin effectively a tube. That tube then gets thicker and thicker, and eventually it arrives at a thickness that's strong enough to be like a column. It's then coated with a veneer, like a plastic coating, to keep it sort of from absorbing water. And then he designed these connection pieces to allow it to be used as a piece of engineering. And you can see in here, he's building this entire church on site for a displaced community out of cardboard, and eventually creating this space for their users. Even the pulpit here, which is where the sermon is held, is made out of cardboard. The chairs are not made out of cardboard, but supports for the main altar table is also out of cardboard. And it's a beautiful space. And so there is a way to synthesize the kind of need of the community, the need of the brief, which is, can we have a space that feels like you're worshiping God, the material that you use to build it, and of course, creating an environment in which people come together in such an amazing way. And that's it looking at the back. Again, this is sort of colored glass that is set into a cardboard framework of triangles. And so that's the main entrance door. And when you stand back on the outside, you end up with this church that was put up in a few months' time, not too long. Outside here is carbon it's a plastic sheeting material, which is used for bus stops, etc. Again, low cost. So I think that's sort of what I wanted to show. And the idea was to explore a little bit of the inherent issues that architecture deals with, which is the ability to create something that you have to imagine. At the very mundane end, and I was talking about that with Ruth, the idea that architecture can be many things. If you're thinking about whether to study it, the principal thing I think you should be interested in if you want to study architecture per se is, are you interested in creating space, buildings, working on the technologies required to create architecture and building. Within that, there are a lot of different ways to sort of express your interest. At the very early stages of design, it's very conceptual. You're trying to understand the brief, the client, the climate, the market, and come up with ideas that the building is based on. In the second part of the design, you go from concept to what we call schematic. And the schematic is where you take that concept of an idea and you begin to explore it in real terms. Proper plans, proper sections, what materials you make it out of, organizing the different trades. We are a very collaborative profession. We work with engineers, whether it's structure, mechanical, electrical, plumbing. We work with landscape consultants. We have to work with the client. We have to work with the guy who's got the purse strings, the budget. And so we begin to coordinate the idea into something that is a building or the potential for a building. And that's another kind of skill set. Eventually it goes into the technical side where we have to document the building that needs to be built, the instructions for the builder. What does the guy who's doing the bricklaying do? What does the concrete guy do? What does the steel guy do? What does the plumber do? The architect draws it through and gives everybody their instructions so that everyone works coordinated. A bit like in an orchestra, the conductor who knows the score has to be able to direct all the 150 or 200 people in the orchestra to create a single piece of music. And so we need to know a little bit about all their trades. So similar to a conductor who knows about the piano, the violin, the flute section, etc. We have to know a little bit about structural engineering, a bit about services, a bit about environmental, all of these things. But at the same time, we also know the overall outcome of the project, which is the building. At a very technical end, you have construction, where the building goes to site and you're looking at, putting on boots and a hard hat and talking to the builders and seeing whether they are able to execute your idea in the proper way. So that's sort of the architectural profession. And talking to you as a student body, and again, I wish I had had a talk like this when I was in 10th or 11th grade or 12th grade, because there's a lot of misconceptions about what architecture is, what it can be. But fundamentally, I think if you are fascinated or in any way interested in what you saw here today, it's worth exploring whether architecture is for you, because it is a great journey of education. It's a longer one, certainly longer than some others. In the UK, you can do something in 3 years, be done with. Architecture is generally a 5-year academic degree, and usually there's 2 more years before you can get licensed. In other words, before you can practice on your own. So it is a slow boil profession, but it's one in which you learn a huge amount, and one in which you will be equipped with skills that I think are extremely usable, not just in architecture, but generally, which is problem solving, understanding how to see a problem and to break it down into ways that can be addressed. It's collaborative, which today everything we do now is collaborative. You have to be able to work with people, be able to harness their energy and be able to get them on board. And so it's collaborative. It's creative, it's technical. And in the end of the day, at least in the pure architectural sense, you leave behind something that's there. It's got, brick and mortar, as it were. And one of the things I greatly enjoy when looking back on my 35-year career is the fact that I can look at some buildings that I've been responsible for and go, oh, okay, I've done that. So there's great satisfaction in the construction side of things. And as I was saying to Ruth earlier, if you're thinking about the design profession, I'm happy to talk about that as well. There are a lot of other design-related areas of study that can be explored. You don't have to study architecture, which is usually quite specific. But there is now interior design, there's landscaping design, there is product design, if you want to design a phone, a car, this or that. And there's even material technology design, which is more about the investigation into new technologies and how they might be advanced to create the tools with which you then create other things.
It's really awesome. I think that's a really fantastic overview of the history of architecture and exactly what it's all about. I think through that talk, Hans, you've answered quite a few of the questions that have come through, but I've had some sent direct to me as well. So a lot of students are interested about your own career and your own profession. So we've got a couple of questions like, what was your favourite project as an architect? And where did you work before you owned your own firm? And I've got another one on what was your favourite project to do as an architect in your career? So I think they're interested to know more about you, Hans. So if you'd like to share a little bit about your history as an architect and a couple of your favourite projects, that would be amazing.
Okay. I worked for 8 years for this guy, Norman Foster, who's been responsible for the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, the erotic gherkin in London, to a whole number of things. But it was a great learning curve for me. I stayed at the university, so I spent some 4 years in the UK, 3 in Japan, and 1.5 in Frankfurt. So that was the beginning. I set up HP Design. Oh, I worked on these projects, which is a fantastic.
I don't think you're sharing your screen anymore.
Oh, hang on. Yeah, my fault. Ah, so many moving parts. Here we go.
Yeah.
So these are some of the projects. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yeah, these are some of the projects. Get rid of that. that I worked on with Norman Foster's company. In Japan, it was Century Tower. In Frankfurt, it was Commerzbank headquarters. And these are some private houses in Japan as well. HP Design is based in Bangkok, where we have an office. We have an office in Singapore, and we have a small group of people in Jakarta. But we work mainly in the Middle East, Asia, a lot of projects in India, a bit in Japan, but a lot in the Philippines and Thailand and Vietnam. As I said, we specialize in, I guess, high-rise or at least high-tech buildings. We've got a lot of residential, quite a lot of offices. We've done quite a lot of high-rise residential in Asian cities. One of the things about Asia is it's got a lot of need for building, especially in countries like Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, and India. So we do quite a lot of those buildings. And what we tell people as our, I guess, important distinguishing features that we tend to work on architecture in an evolutionary way. So the idea, and if you remember Darwin, creator of the Origin of Species, he was looking at the way evolution works is that lots of different mutations occur, and then of course they're tested in nature, and through the testing and the proving of themselves, the survival of the fittest have end up maintaining themselves and being able to propagate. So we do the same thing. We do a lot of study, and we explore lots of different ways of solving the same problem. And then these get whittled down eventually through initial 3D studies, model studies, design studies into the scheme that proves itself the best. So that's something we do. These are some of our projects. This is in Bangkok. It's a 250-meter high-rise in the river. This is a 280-meter high-rise being built in Mumbai. This is about a 200-meter high-rise in central Manila, and this is in Pattaya on the south of Thailand. So these are some of the projects that we've done at the high-rise level. If I go to, I guess, our origins, these are some of the projects at the very beginning. We started off in houses. So here's some very simple houses that are indicative of the kind of work we do. And I always tell our clients that the house is sort of the epitome of design, where you are caring for somebody's environment. We try to keep that in mind even when we're doing big buildings. So these are some of the houses we've done. But usually, again, we try to distinguish ourselves by saying, how can we rethink the house? When you think of house and you go, how many ways are there to design a house? You'd be surprised. Every house can be unique because you're responding to different conditions. Then from house, we went to larger projects, just a few of them. This one here is a kind of an interesting project. It's about 140 units in Phuket. It's on a hillside, so it kind of becomes like a hill town. We wanted to create an architecture that wasn't giant blocks. We wanted to have something that was sort of permeated with lots of balconies and greenery. So we did that. The units themselves all open up to the view with sliding glass. From there, we went to some high-rise buildings, which is this one. Again, this is a way to introduce some interesting spaces. This is a sky terrace at level 39. So you're about 150 meters above the water, and you have 50-meter lap pool, a gym, and a spa.
A couple of questions come in. Do you have a favorite material to use when you're building?
No, I think the answer to that is the material needs to suit the purpose. And so my particular approach is, I mean, there are some architects who just do white, and that's all they do. And some architects who just do steel and glass, other ones who just do, brick and mortar. I find that a little limiting because I think the world of materials is there for us to use. And so when we look at what material to make things out of, we tend to look at what's appropriate. And we open up the inquiry to say, listen, let's not be preconceived. One of the problems with preconceptions is that it eliminates all other possibilities at the outset. And I think that's one of the challenges of creative thinking, is to say, let's not exclude anything. Let's imagine anything is possible and see what comes out of the rigor of thinking about that material. Otherwise, you would never have had those buildings out of bamboo, or shigeru bands made out of cardboard, or even those adventurous architects in the 1800s who built steel structures that never existed before. They are all predicated on the idea of saying, let's explore without prejudice. So that would be my answer.
Another great question. Do you yourself have a favorite architect? And the question is also about role models. So did you have a role model?
Well, obviously working for Norman Foster was a great, inspiring way to start my career. He is still today, after a 65-year career, one of the leading lights in architectural design and construction. Going back in history, some of the greats of history, Le Corbusier, who is a great thinker and a problem solver. As I said, architecture is about problem solving, and Le Corbusier succinctly summarized the challenge with architecture lies in how you ask the question. If you know how to ask the question properly, the solution will manifest. And his example was really clever. He says, listen, as an example of flight, since time immemorial, Neanderthal man, prehistoric man saw bird and went, I want to fly like a bird. And so for millennia, all design exercises were based on that question, how do I fly like a bird? So they all look like birds. Leonardo da Vinci's structures, the people who were sort of throwing themselves off cliffs with wing-like shape trying to flap, they all failed because the question was already pointed to the solution, fly like a bird. The people who solved the problem of how to fly were the Wright brothers, who rephrased the question and said, listen, how do I fly? Let's not say like a bird, because then all of a sudden your solutions are all bird-based. And they invented Kitty Hawk, which knew nothing like a bird. And if you understand a little bit about aerodynamics, you realize that what lifts a plane, a 747 off the ground, has nothing to do with the bird dynamics. It's not about flapping your wings, etc. It's about lift and movement. So the idea of, I guess, asking the right question. So Le Corbusier is another one. And then, of course, the greats of history, the dome done by Filippo Brunelleschi in 1480. Again, to me, if I try to imagine the time, that was a time when people were still being burnt at the stake. People had no idea about the sort of rational thought and things like that. It was coming out of the Dark Ages. So these people who really managed to think out of the box and to create something that nobody could have imagined.
That's a fantastic answer. I hope that helps. Another great question. How do you balance form and function in your projects?
That's probably the fundamental question that we are asked as practicing architects. When you're in university, it can become a little bit more esoteric, a little bit more creatively driven. Unfortunately, the real world, the world in which people have to build things, is also predicated on budget, availability, time, market uptake. And so in the end, I find that the successful piece of architecture that we do, because it all gets built, is a synthesis of a lot of competing concerns. I can't deal with it just as a form or a beautiful space or a material I'd like to use. I have to include how much money do I have? How quickly do I have to build it? How long does it have to last? Who are the people using it? What's the weather that it's going to be in? Is it going to weather well? Will it survive, 20 years? And so in the end, I find that if you understand the greater context of what the real problem is of the architecture we're building, you will see the solution as reflecting all of those concerns. And I think there are a lot of architects out there who deal with just what they want to, which is how does it look? How will it photograph? Can it be on the front of a magazine? And I find they limit themselves to just the aesthetics. And that's not really where true buildings are finding their worth, their meaning.
So would you say that the course that they do, that students would go and do at university, is perhaps a bit more creative than the real world, and there's a higher level of creative content that might not work in the real world?
Yeah, there is that, and I think universities have been moving around a lot. When I went to university in Zurich at the ETH, it was incredibly technical. They just wanted you to be good builders. How do you hold the snow up? How do you keep the rain out? How do you keep buildings warm? All that stuff. And now ETH is one of the more creative universities where a lot of people are saying that their students are not useful in the industry. They come out having no idea about how a real building works. So there's always a flux. And when you look at universities, you will see different curricula and different concepts being applied. So be curious about what kind of teaching they have, right? Some universities are very unabashed about being esoteric and being about future forward thinking and nothing to do with, real world problems. In Holland, I think University of is it Delft? I think it's one of the really creative ones. In the UK, it's the AA. And these are ones who are trying to explore 3D modeling and the idea of future buildings being, made out of fantastic shapes, of which there are great examples of that. I would say there are 1% of 1% of 1% of buildings. 99.99% of buildings are to do with things that I have to deal with, which is real buildings in real cities with real budgets and real problems. So look at the university's curriculum, see if it suits your character. Architecture is not one thing. The school.
I think that's really good advice. And one way of doing that is looking at the course requirements. So there are, UCL in the UK is very famous for its architecture, and it is very design based. But places like Bath, they don't really require that portfolio. So it's not going to be so design based. So I think it's really, really important to look at where you want to go. I've got a question about your course. How much time do you feel your students spend working on their coursework as opposed to in your lectures? So how much time do you think they need to work on their ideas and things outside of the lecture time?
Well, the lecture time, architecture doesn't really have a lot of lectures. They have the base courses, which is history and technology, and other courses, which I don't teach. I teach design, which is a studio-based course. So I meet with my students for 8 hours a week, usually 2 4-hour sessions, Tuesday and Thursday. And design, unfortunately, in architecture is the kind of tail that wags the dog. So, architecture students want to do design, so they usually push all the other courses into the back and say, I'm going to spend, 50 hours a week doing my project. And we like it as the design professors. You do have to juggle all the other courses because they're all part of it. But honestly, the true kind of arena in which architecture is played out is when you are given a project, and that's in your design project. You're given a site, a brief, and you have a semester to design something. And so you spend an inordinate amount of time doing that. And architecture is a process which is never finished. That's the difference between, I guess, maths or engineering, where the equation 2 + 2 is 4. Okay, I'm done. Architecture, you're never really done. There's always more work to be done. So it does require a good level of understanding of how much is enough. How do I contain the problem? How do I generate a solution that is excellent in its own right? And how do I manage my time? So that's what you'll find almost common throughout all architecture courses. There are all the courses you have to take to be able to graduate with a degree in architecture, and then there's the design course. One a semester. Design Studio 1 in year 1, semester 2 in year 1, and you go on to 2 semesters, and you go through that 5 years in a row, and so you've had 10 design studios with 10 different teachers. And those are the ones where you're going to learn a little bit about, okay, what's it take to design a project.
Oh, that sounds really detailed there. So it's a lot of work outside of class, I think, is what we can take from our degree. Has to be, yeah. I've got a question, sorry.
Generally, the studio is there for presenting your ideas and discussing them. Then you go away and work on them. So the format is usually you come, you pin up, you present your project, we discuss it as a group, and you get feedback. You don't do any work in the class other than the interface between you, the prof, and your fellow students. Then you go away to your studio, home, or the studio at the university, and you refine and work and create the next round of content.
A lot of hours there. I've got a question about how could I prepare myself before enrolling in architecture course? So maybe just about before somebody does architecture at NUS, or indeed your design class, how would you expect them to be preparing themselves whilst they're at school?
I don't think you're going to prepare yourself for the class. I think you can prepare yourself to have a good chance of getting in where you want to get in. Now more and more universities, NUS is not so critical about that, but I know other universities ask for your portfolio. And so, again, curate your portfolio. You might have done photography. It can be photography on your phone. It can be, model making. It can be sketching. It can be drawing. It can be any kind of creative process which demonstrates to the school that you're applying to, here's somebody who thinks creatively. So think of that as a kind of calling card by which they say, I've got 1,000 students and I can accept 100. So 90% are going to get culled, right? And unfortunately, a lot of the better universities have a lot of applicants, and you have to make the cut. So I think it's about the portfolio, which in architecture is probably your key document. When you graduate from university, Nobody asks you what you did in physics or how you did in technology or history. They say, show me your design portfolio, which is a booklet with pictures, drawings, sketches, rendering, whatever it is. They go, oh, okay. And it's a very visceral piece of communication that then universities look at. So when I see a portfolio that a student at your age has got, and I don't expect it to be architecture, unless you're really fortunate to have worked in architecture practice. But usually it's about saying, are you intuitively creative? Are you curious about the beauty of creation, and where does that manifest? It can just be amazing photography. It can be, drawings and sketches. It can be notes that you've taken, anything like that just basically says, this is who I am, and I'd like to apply this is who I am to the idea of architecture. So that's what I would suggest in the interest of preparing yourself for university. Once you're in university, architecture is one of those degrees that is quite straightforward. You just do the work and you will evolve and you'll get better.
That's a great answer. I think, if there's any students here that are wondering how they can do that whilst they're at school, please do come and see us in the HE department. I've got one question. It was a student who commented on how many different countries you talked about in your talk. Do you have a favourite country or a favourite piece of architecture? And if so, which country is that in?
I don't have a favourite. It's like asking me what's your favourite child, but I think working in Asia has been extremely challenging. Europe is an old place, and so you see a lot of projects that are what we call iconic projects, where there's a huge amount of budget, a huge amount of interest involved. This project, for instance, in India, it's a very modest piece of architecture in terms of its budget, and so being able to achieve what we have been able to achieve with this in India has been, for me, one of the great highlights. It's an office building, and we have these wonderful screens that cut out 60% of the heat. So it's a very high performing ecological footprint. It's got this amazing spaces that sort of, contain the atrium, which looks like this. And this is all in a place called Pune, which is a second tier city. It's not Mumbai or Delhi, Bangalore. It's basically a smaller city. And so having been able to create a piece of architecture like this in Mumbai, or a piece of architecture like this in Ho Chi Minh City, which again is a modest building where we've managed to sort of create an office building that really is quite a landmark there, by virtue of the ideas we brought to the table. It's basically an office building, but we've clad it in this sort of unusual skin that's an environmental skin. And so again, it's been predicated on ecological performance. So a lot of the things that I find beautiful are the ones that have proven themselves to be purposeful. And that's when real architecture becomes, I guess, long-lasting, because it does its job well. This is a building that's only 15 years old, and people still talk about it being one of the more adventurous buildings on the skyline in Ho Chi Minh City, because it actually does its job well. Everyone can do a gimmick, do something that's sort of a bit like an image, but real buildings have to work for what their needs are. So I like working in Southeast Asia, and I think you're in Southeast Asia. It is, for the next 20, 30 years, the place where there's the most work required. And so you're already starting out being in a place where, take a string that's 500 kilometers long and draw a circle around where you are, and you'll say, probably half the population of the planet lives here. And they're moving to the cities, they need buildings, we need to do the work. I think that's always a great place to be, where you're at the forefront of the need for buildings, and then you can get involved.
I think that's a great answer. I mean, it's a very good thing to think about now, is where they might want to work in the future. Where is there a need for architects, and where is there a need for this kind of architecture? I think I can leave you with one final question, Hans. It's and I think really you've touched on this throughout your presentation in lots of different ways, but it's about creative thinking with regards to architecture. And I think what you've shown the students here is how you can think about the spaces in terms of emotion, how you can think about spaces in terms of the materials. And even the ones you've just highlighted there's so many creative thinking that you've shown our students throughout this presentation. Is there any final tips you would have about that creative thought process with regards to architecture?
Well, I think the biggest challenge we have as humans, I think, is prejudice. Prejudice is two words that go into prejudgment. We come with prejudgment, and that limits creativity. It's our worst enemy. We are prejudiced when it comes to race. We are prejudiced when it comes to politics. We're prejudiced when it comes to material. I like this. I like that. We are prejudiced when it comes to space. And unfortunately, prejudice is usually founded on what we know, right? And what I remember very clearly in first year architecture, when they were showing me as a young student the modern icons of the industry, I thought all the buildings that they were showing were ugly because I didn't understand. They didn't look like buildings I had seen. They were a modern piece of architecture. And only with time and education did I begin to understand their value. And so I think the main thing I would say, and it doesn't have to do with architecture only, it's anything to do with engagement with the world, with your fellow humans, with your profession, with your studies, is try to be mindful of prejudice. See if you are being prejudiced. Are you precluding the idea because you say this is how it should be? Are you precluding the possibilities because you see them as reflecting what you know? And what we know is usually a big obstacle to what can be, right? And so I'll leave you with the motto that we have in HB Design, which usually shocks the client. We say, the role of the architect is not to give the client what he wants, at which point there's usually a big intake of air. Oh, what are you talking about? And then I say, the role of the architect is to show the client what he could never imagine he could have. So
that is a fantastic motto to end with. So I think that's a really good thing for our students to think about. So I don't think there's any more questions come through. So I think that's all the questions from the students. So one final question. Do you have any book recommendations?
Oh, sure. Well, I'm just thinking about a book that's fun to read as opposed to the historical books. I'll give you a few that are based on, I guess, thought-provoking books. One is called Delirious New York. Delirious New York, which is, you'll find it. It's quite a well-known book by a very incredibly creative thinker called Rem Koolhaas. Which, if you're interested in architecture, the Dutch would know he's pronounced Koolhaas. He is probably the leading light of out-of-the-box thinking in architecture in the last 70 years. And he wrote a book in his young age, when he was in his 20s, called Delirious New York, which is all about the kind of amazing things that humans are capable of when it comes to the built environment. So I would say that's a good way of sort of shaking things up a little bit. It's not an easy read, but it does kind of show what's possible. And if you follow up a little bit with looking at Rem Koolhaas's, I guess, evolution and what he's done, and his company, which is called OMA, he really has opened the door to what architecture can be. I think that, to me, is always a great thing for young, budding, aspiring architects to sort of, shoot for the moon, right? Because even if you miss, you still hit the stars. Don't tie yourself down right from the outset.
Absolutely. I think that's really good advice there. Okay, so if there are no more questions, students, feel free to leave the Zoom. And Hans, if you wouldn't mind hanging on just to have a quick chat after the students leave.
Nope. I've talked to you, and good luck with the rest of your high school education. Before you know it, you'll be at a university somewhere, hopefully, and enjoying yourself. See where the road takes you. Good luck with all of that.
It'll go very quickly. So yeah, thank you so much, Hans, for that absolutely amazing presentation. And I think it has been so thought-provoking and so many practical examples of architecture and what they can be doing, what they can be thinking about. And just, yeah, if you're interested in this talk, then really, really consider architecture at university level.